When I was one of Jehovah's Witnesses, I actively used this book, You Can Live Forever in Paradise on Earth, to try and start home Bible studies with whomever I could. And as soon as I had the chance, I would always show a potential student this illustration from the book, and I would have them read the adjacent paragraph which stated, "How would you feel if proof was given that what you believe is wrong? For example, say you were in a car travelling for the first time to a certain place. You have a road map, but you have not taken time to check it carefully. Someone has told you the road to take. You trust him, sincerely believing that the way he has directed you is correct. But suppose it's not. What if someone points out the error? What if he, by referring to your own map, shows that you're on the wrong road? Would pride or stubbornness prevent you from admitting that you're on the wrong road?" You see, I always thought that the guy here in this illustration was me, obviously because I had the truth, and the guy in the car that's lost, well, he was you being the person I was trying to start a free home Bible study with. What I was soon to find out was in fact that I was the guy in the car who was lost. So how did I first discover that I was lost? The first thing that made me question what I believed was not something from an apostate's book or information from another religion. It was this edition of Zion's WatchTower in which Charles Russell, the then president of the WatchTower, wrote, "But bear in mind that the end of 1914 is not the date for the beginning, but for the end of the time of trouble." Now, I'll tell you why as a Jehovah's Witness this confused me and started me questioning what I believed. I was taught that Russell and the Bible students, which Jehovah's people were known as back then, foretold that the conclusion of the system of things, or the last days, or the beginning of the time of the end, whatever you want to call it, it would start in 1914, and this would mark the beginning of the time of trouble because this is when Satan was cast out of heaven. And this information was special knowledge from God handed exclusively to Jehovah's people as testimony to the fact that Jehovah's Witnesses had the truth. But now I discover, completely by accident while researching something totally unrelated to 1914 and the last days, that Russell and the Bible students predicted that 1914 would mark the end of the time of trouble. This was directly the opposite of what I'd been taught. This information started me on the road to many months of research, and here is only some of what I've uncovered so far. In the early 1890s, Russell began to teach that the time of the end of the conclusion of the system, or the last days, started in 1799. This belief was continued after his death. As you can see in this publication, The Harp of God, published in 1928, the governing body continued to teach this understanding as truth. Right up until the end of 1914, Russell believed that Jesus had begun reigning as King of God's kingdom in 1878, and that Armageddon would occur in 1914, being the end of the time of trouble. So to make it easier, here is what Russell and the Bible students believed up until the end of 1914. So why was I confused about these dates? Mainly because of articles published by the governing body recently, such as this one. In this 2004 WatchTower, it discusses that Jehovah had revealed when the appointed times of the nations would end and when God's kingdom rule begins. Both of these events, according to the governing body, occurred in the year 1914. So where it says here, as that time approached, they're talking about before 1914. So before 1914, Jehovah took steps to reveal the answer to a group of humble Bible students. With the help of God's Spirit, they discerned that the appointed times of the nations began with the destruction of Jerusalem in 607 BCE, and that those times were 2,520 years in length. From this, they deduced that 1914 marked the end of the appointed times of the nations. They also came to realize that 1914 was the beginning of the end for this system of things. Now, on reading that last part that I've underlined in red, it would appear to indicate that the Bible students, during the time leading up to 1914, realized that 1914 was the beginning of the end for this system. This happens a lot in the WatchTower publications where they subtly suggest this idea, so it's easy for the reader to assume that before 1914 the Bible students believed what the WatchTower believes today, but this is not the case. You will never ever find one written statement anywhere in any of Russell's publications prior to 1914 where he or anyone associated with him states that 1914 was the beginning of the end for this system. Russell absolutely believed right up until the end of 1914 that the beginning of the end started in 1799. So I wanted to show you this article as it's a typical example of WatchTower wordplay around 1914. Here's another quote from the What Does the Bible Really Teach publication. On page 84, paragraph 22, it references a prophetic scripture from Psalm, which is talking about a future time when Jesus would be anointed as king, but there would be a waiting period. In paragraph 23, it asks for how long. It says, quote, "During the 19th century, sincere Bible students calculated that the waiting period would end in 1914. World events that began in 1914 confirm that the calculation of these sincere Bible students was correct. The fulfillment of Bible prophecy shows that in 1914, Christ became king and God's heavenly kingdom began to rule." If you're a witness following this video, you probably didn't spot the key point, because you've heard it so many times you assume what you're reading is truth. So let me reread that first bit. During the 19th century, sincere Bible students calculated that the waiting period would end in 1914. So here the governing body is stating that the Bible students had calculated before the end of the 19th century, so before the end of the year 1900, they were expecting the waiting period to end and that Jesus would begin ruling as king in 1914. For those of you who are not familiar with what this waiting period is about, you will note the article is quoting Psalm 110 verse 1 and Acts chapter 2. These two portions of scripture are often used together by the WatchTower to reinforce the same point, as brought out in this article in a 2000 WatchTower, that Jesus had to wait until 1914 before he could take action as appointed king. So, had the Bible students in the 19th century calculated that the waiting period would end in 1914? In other words, were they really expecting Christ to begin ruling as king in 1914? This, again, is a complete lie. What the Bible students in the 19th century believed was that Christ had already begun ruling in 1878. For them, the waiting period was over, as the rulership of God's kingdom had already begun. What's interesting is that when making claims such as this, the governing body never once, ever references quotes or articles written by the Bible students to back their statements. Very few Jehovah's Witnesses actually check these things. They just assume if it's from the governing body, then it must be the truth. What's interesting is the point here. World events that began in 1914 confirmed the calculation of the Bible students was correct. But the Bible students had very different expectations and a very different viewpoint on events leading up to 1914 than how the WatchTower presents them today. Again, Russell and the Bible students believed that world events proved they were already in the last days, which they taught began in 1799. They were not expecting Christ to be made king in 1914 or for world events to get worse. They were expecting the end of the time of trouble because their calculations proved, according to them, that Christ had already started reigning as king in 1878 and that the world would end in 1914. With a very small amount of effort just researching within the WatchTower publications, you'll uncover dozens upon dozens of quotes that have been written after 1914, all of them stating categorically that the Bible students prior to 1914 accurately predicted two things ahead of time: that Jesus Christ would begin ruling as king in 1914, and that the conclusion of the system of things would begin in 1914. Again, you will not find anything written by Russell or his associates prior to 1914 that confirms these statements. So give it a go. Test to see whether or not what the governing body is telling you is actually the truth. They state that the Bible students understood and believed prior to 1914 that Jesus Christ would start to rule as king of God's kingdom in 1914, and that the conclusion of the system of things would begin in 1914. So my challenge is, do your research, don't use any publications or look at any publications outside of the WatchTower. And in the comments below this video, cite an article written prior to 1914 by any one of the Bible students, it doesn't have to be Russell, predicting any one of the above events would occur in 1914.